On a moonless night in the South China Sea, radar operators aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford detect nothing. The Combat Information Center hums with routine chatter. Then, in the span of 18 seconds, 4 J-20 hypersonic anti-ship missiles breach the carrier's defensive perimeter. The Phalanx CIWS engages. 2 missiles are intercepted. 2 are not. The question isn't whether China's J-20 stealth fighter could penetrate American carrier defenses. The question is what happens in the 40 minutes after it does, when the United States must decide whether a single strike constitutes an act of war or the opening salvo of something far worse. Because in modern naval warfare, the first shot isn't fired to sink a ship, it's fired to collapse a decision-making framework.
The Chengdu J-20 was never designed to dogfight American F-35s. Its purpose is more specific and more dangerous, to operate as a penetrating strike platform in contested airspace where traditional fourth-generation fighters cannot survive. With a combat radius exceeding 1,200 miles when configured for maritime strike, the J-20 can launch standoff weapons against carrier groups without ever entering the engagement envelope of SM-6 interceptors or carrier-based fighter patrols. This is not speculation. In 2022, satellite imagery confirmed the deployment of J-20s to air bases in the Paracel Islands, forward positions that place them within striking range of the Philippine Sea, where the 7th Fleet operates continuously. The aircraft carries 4 internal hardpoints designed for PL-15 air-to-air missiles, but in anti-surface configuration, it can deploy YJ-21 or CJ-100 cruise missiles, weapons optimized for penetrating layered naval defenses. The YJ-21 in particular represents a doctrinal shift. Unlike older subsonic anti-ship missiles, it combines a ballistic trajectory with terminal maneuvering, descending at speeds exceeding Mach 10. The U.S. Navy's Aegis combat system, which has defined surface warfare for 3 decades, was engineered to intercept aircraft and cruise missiles, not projectiles that behave like intercontinental ballistic missiles in their final phase. This creates a detection problem. By the time radar identifies a descending hypersonic threat, the engagement window has collapsed to under 6 seconds. But the strike itself is not the crisis. The crisis is what the strike forces the United States to conclude about Chinese intent. If a J-20 successfully launches against a carrier group and even 1 missile impacts, the immediate question is not tactical, it's strategic. Did China authorize this strike as a deliberate escalation, or did a regional commander act independently, believing deterrence had already failed? The difference matters because the American response hinges entirely on attribution, and attribution requires time the scenario does not provide.
The immediate military response to a carrier strike would be escalatory but measured. U.S. doctrine calls for proportional retaliation, likely targeting the airbase from which the J-20 launched, using Tomahawk cruise missiles or B-2 stealth bombers. But proportionality assumes both sides share an understanding of what constitutes equivalence. China does not view its coastal defenses as equivalent to American carrier groups. It views them as asymmetric deterrents designed to offset America's expeditionary advantages. Destroying a Chinese airbase in response to a carrier strike does not restore the status quo. It confirms that the United States interprets any damage to its fleet as justification for strikes on Chinese sovereign territory. This is precisely the scenario Beijing has gamed for decades. Not because it wants war, but because it wants to demonstrate that war with China is unsustainable for the United States. The goal is not victory in the traditional sense. The goal is to make American force projection in the Western Pacific prohibitively costly. Within 72 hours of a successful strike, the strategic picture deteriorates. The damaged carrier withdraws to Guam or Pearl Harbor for repairs, reducing American naval presence in theater. China does not invade Taiwan in response, not yet, but it does expand air patrols over the median line of the Taiwan Strait. It does increase the frequency of gray zone incursions, testing whether the United States remains willing to enforce its red lines. And it watches carefully to see whether Japan, which has pledged support for Taiwan's defense, interprets the carrier strike as evidence that American security guarantees are no longer reliable. This is the cascading failure that planners fear most. Not a single catastrophic event, but a sequence of decisions that erode the architecture of deterrence, one assumption at a time. South Korea begins exploring independent nuclear deterrent options. Australia accelerates its acquisition of long-range strike capabilities. The Philippines reconsiders its hosting of American forces. None of these developments alone constitute a crisis, but together they represent a structural shift. American hegemony in the Indo-Pacific is no longer assumed, it is contested.
The deeper problem is not whether the U.S. can defend against a J-20 strike. The deeper problem is that defending successfully does not prevent escalation. It may accelerate it. If China believes its stealth platforms and hypersonic missiles can evade American defenses, it gains confidence in its ability to impose costs. If the United States successfully intercepts those strikes, China concludes that its existing capabilities are insufficient and invests more heavily in next-generation systems, sixth-generation fighters, AI-enabled swarming munitions, directed energy weapons. This dynamic is already visible. The People's Liberation Army has begun deploying J-11 stealth drones alongside J-20s, creating a layered penetration capability where manned and unmanned platforms operate in concert. The J-11, with its subsonic speed and reduced payload, is not designed to sink carriers. It is designed to saturate defenses, forcing American interceptors to engage multiple low-value targets while higher-value threats slip through. This is not hypothetical. PLA exercises in 2023 simulated exactly this tactic, using drone swarms to overwhelm simulated Aegis defenses. The United States, in response, is accelerating development of directed energy weapons, high-powered lasers capable of engaging multiple inbound threats without depleting missile inventories. But these systems are not yet fielded at scale, and their effectiveness against hypersonic missiles remains unproven. The result is a window of vulnerability that both sides are aware of. China knows it has a temporary advantage. The United States knows it must either deter strikes during this window or accept losses it has not experienced since World War II. And deterrence in this context is psychological. It depends not on capability alone, but on the adversary's belief that using that capability will result in unacceptable consequences. The problem is defining unacceptable when both sides possess nuclear arsenals, cyber warfare capabilities, and economic interdependencies that make total war irrational. The threshold for conflict has not disappeared, it has become ambiguous, and ambiguity in crisis is indistinguishable from opportunity.
If the J-20 strike succeeds in damaging a U.S. carrier, the long-term consequences extend far beyond the immediate military response. The psychological impact on American strategic culture would be profound. For 70 years, carrier strike groups have been the visible manifestation of American power, mobile, survivable, and untouchable. A successful strike dismantles that assumption. It does not prove that carriers are obsolete, but it proves they are vulnerable in ways that fundamentally alter their operational utility. The question then becomes whether the United States can sustain its forward presence in the Indo-Pacific without accepting a higher level of risk than its political system can tolerate. Carriers cost $13 billion each. Losing one, or even having one taken out of service for 2 years of repairs, represents not just a material loss, but a strategic admission. It confirms that China has developed the capability to hold American power projection at risk within the First Island chain. This is not about Taiwan. Taiwan is the scenario that justifies the capability. The real concern is that once China demonstrates it can strike carriers with impunity, every other adversary begins calculating whether they can do the same. Iran begins investing more heavily in anti-ship ballistic missiles. Russia accelerates development of its Zircon hypersonic cruise missile. North Korea, which already possesses theater ballistic missiles, begins exploring maritime strike variants. The proliferation is not immediate, but the trajectory is clear. And the United States, in response, faces a choice that has no satisfying answer. It can withdraw carriers from high-risk environments, accepting a reduction in forward presence. It can invest more heavily in defensive systems, attempting to restore the margin of superiority it once enjoyed. Or it can redefine its strategic posture entirely, shifting towards distributed, lower-signature platforms that trade individual combat power for survivability. Each option represents a different theory of victory, and none are guaranteed to succeed.
The scenario is not whether a J-20 could strike a U.S. carrier group. The scenario is whether the United States could respond to that strike in a way that restores deterrence without triggering the conflict both sides have spent decades trying to avoid. And the uncomfortable answer is that no response fully resolves the dilemma. Retaliation risks escalation. Restraint risks irrelevance. What makes this scenario uniquely dangerous is not the technology. It is the compression of decision-making time in an environment where attribution is uncertain, intentions are ambiguous, and the cost of miscalculation is existential. The J-20 is not just a weapons platform, it is a test of whether the strategic assumptions that have governed American power since 1945 remain valid in an era where stealth, hypersonics, and information dominance have distributed lethality across multiple domains. The real risk is not that China strikes first. The real risk is that the United States no longer knows what victory looks like after it does.